People in. Once they're settled, we'll get started. Welcome, Chris. Welcome, Stephanie.
Hello.
Good to see you here.
Hello.
All right, great. So I'll give you guys like a quick overview of how we run the session because I don't think either of you guys have been here before. But really appreciate you attending. We're streaming live, like I said, on Facebook, YouTube, but also we'll just do an interview here. I'll introduce our hosts here and they'll give you a little bit of a wave, and then our guest, Cortland. And you guys can ask questions or contribute comments during the interview process, which will last maybe about a half hour. And then we'll maybe move it to the hosts to interact a little bit. And then you can even jump in and ask questions via audio, video later on in the session. Or if you feel more comfortable, you can just put them in the chat and I'll translate them. But this is for you because you're here. So at least after an initial setup, we want to gear it towards what's valuable to you. So definitely feel free to ask questions and interject when you find things that are useful. Okay? Awesome. All right. So I'll trust everybody else to let people in from the waiting room after this. So I'll start to kind of give an introduction here. So Business Podcast Mastermind. This started with a few talented friends in the business and podcasting space who expanded it to create a weekly event where a wider audience can join. And among your hosts here, we have Rob Greenlee, who may slip in later. He's the VP of Content and Partnerships at Libsyn, chair of the Podcast Academy, co-host of the New Media Show, and longtime evangelist in the podcasting industry. Henry Lopez, who can give you a little wave. He's a serial entrepreneur, small business coach, and host of the top-rated How of Business podcast. He's dedicated to helping others start, run, and grow their small businesses. Vinay Koshi can give you a wave. He's the host of the Predictable B2B podcast, founder of Sproutworth. He helps others achieve predictable business growth and influence through content marketing. And I'm Ethan Janney. I'm a business and executive coach. I co-host the Run With It podcast. We invite 7+ figure entrepreneurs to share business ideas and the action steps to launch them. And I guess an appropriate announcement, we're joining the Indie Hackers podcast network, of which Cortland Allen is the sort of supreme leader, I suppose you could say.
It's one term.
Fun way. I've never put it that way before. But so we're excited to be part of that as well. And I'll give you guys an introduction to Cortland that I wrote up here so you can have some background, and then we'll get into it. So Cortland Allen, he's a programmer and entrepreneur who attempted to live the traditional VC-funded startup dream and even made it as far as the illustrious Y Combinator. But he left YC without a successful startup, and in the process of failing, realized he fit better in the world of indie hacking solopreneurs. By building a community to support other indie hackers like him, he stumbled upon a powerful niche within which he could build a community platform, a popular podcast, and a path to autonomy and fulfillment in career and life. I made some of that stuff, from my opinion, Cortland, so you can object to any of it.
I like your take.
But yeah, that's my take on Cortland. So welcome, Cortland. I don't know if you have anything you want to say up front or give any further introduction to yourself.
No, I think that was a great intro. I'm happy to be here and talk about podcasting.
Okay, awesome. So yeah, we've been talking a little bit recently because our podcast and a number of others joined the Indie Hackers podcast network, and you've been really generous kind of listening to episodes and giving your opinion. One thing you've highlighted, I think, which is very humble of you, it's just your opinion. You're just coming from one direction, but you've given some interesting tidbits on why you think you've had the success that you've had with podcasting and Indie Hackers. I feel like there's just a couple of things that you highlight generally, which you've said to us, which you think are responsible for maybe the growth of a podcast. Mm-hmm. Do you have any intuitions, again, we'll call it, we don't know for sure, but things that help make your podcast successful and grow to the state it's at?
Yeah. So I guess some background would be helpful. I started Indie Hackers in 2016, and it wasn't a podcast at first. It was just, it was really a blog. I interviewed founders over email. I would post their emails on the website, and I would ask, what's your idea that you're working on? How much money is it making? How did you first get started? How did you market and grow your customer base, et cetera? Just sort of to create a transparent resource so other people who wanted to do the same thing could find these transparent stories, which really I think is a relatively new trend in business where people just kind of share everything going on behind the scenes. And that was really popular. It took off in a big way. My mailing list was growing by like hundreds of people every week. And it wasn't until 5 or 6 months after that that I eventually launched a podcast, when I already had like 15,000 subscribers on my mailing list and 50,000 visitors to the website. And it was already kind of a thing that people wanted to hear. People were asking me to start a podcast rather than me deciding to just do it from scratch. I actually didn't want to. The reason I bring this up is because that's kind of like one of my first intuitive like points about podcast success, even though it's not easy to just replicate with the snap of your fingers. But I think it really helps to have a consistent audience, and it's an existing audience. And it's hard to untangle like what was more important, like having an existing audience of people who already were on a mailing list and I could send podcast episodes to, or was it that I'd done a lot of research for this website and I hit on a particular trend and like kind of a gap in the market, or niche, as you put it, that people just really were hungry to listen to. And even if I hadn't built up an audience, maybe given it was the exact same formula and the exact same target market, they still would have liked the podcast. So it's really difficult to say, but I think both of those together really helped kickstart my particular podcast, which today is about like 120,000 downloads a month, depending on how many episodes I put out. Back then it was like, I think my first week it got like 1,000 downloads, which I was ecstatic about. And since then, it's just been a lot of like experimentation and seeing the numbers go up and down and relation to random things. And as you all know, podcast tooling isn't like the best. It's pretty difficult to reverse engineer exactly why anyone listened to an episode, or even who's listening, or how many times they're listening. So it's hard, which is why I gave Ethan and the other people on the Indie Hackers Podcast Network my little disclaimer that I've only had this one show, and it's hard for me to extrapolate from this to give you general principles, but I can tell you what worked for me and like my intuitions around why I think it's working. So that's kind of my first big one. If at all possible, bring your existing audience to your podcast, have some channel where you can constantly push your podcast out to them. Maybe where there's another story about what you're working on going on Twitter or over email or over a blog. And then, treat your podcast the same way you treat a business. Work backwards from the market, ask who, ask why, what is it that people are seeking? What are they trying to read or learn or understand? And, given the idiosyncrasies of that particular market, what do they need to know? For indie hackers in particular, since I was targeting these people who wanted to start these like very small bootstrapped companies, I did a lot of research elsewhere online to try to find other people sharing these stories and try to find out, okay, what makes someone like one of these stories? What makes someone not like one of these stories? And that was pretty instrumental in me being able to figure out what questions I should even ask in an interview. Like if I had started this podcast or my blog without doing that, I wouldn't have known that it's really important to get transparent revenue numbers from all these companies. I would have thought, oh, no one's going to share their revenue numbers, so I'm just going to do a normal interview and like not put that there. But it turns out people don't like stories that don't have revenue numbers quite nearly as much because they need that context. And so I think just like any other business, like you really need to put in the work to research what your customers want. And all the research I did for the website translated into exactly how I do interviews for the podcast.
I noticed there were two things I think that I remember you highlighted, and that was quality and consistency. And I think that you're speaking a lot to the quality side of things. So if I were to kind of summarize everything that you said, you did research, you didn't just kind of show up and, hit the ground running when people showed up for the podcast. And you also researched the market and the niche even before you started the podcast. Yeah. Of course. So that sounds like it's going into the quality for you. Anything else that goes into the quality nowadays, or what has changed? And also just maybe speak to that consistency aspect if you get a chance.
Yeah. The quality part's super important. I think it's almost, again, just analogous to making, starting any sort of internet business, right? You want to start with your minimum viable product, like an MVP, and it needs to be something that's really quick and easy. So you can try to figure out like what people actually like without wasting a ton of time and money. And for me, that was the blog. And so I kind of workshopped like what interviews do people like? What do they not like? What topics they like? Who is my audience exactly? And that helped with the quality at sort of like a base layer. But then I think there's like podcast specific stuff that's not necessarily related to like some sort of text interview or blog post you write. So with my particular podcast, I think a lot about narrative structure. Like what is the overall structure for an episode? It's a lot harder, I think, to do in audio than it is to do in text, because in text, like the reader has a lot of responsibility. If they find that they've zoned out, they can just go right back and start reading, from a paragraph above. Whereas in a podcast, it's like you've got like these forward and back buttons to skip ahead, but like people are listening to podcasts with their hands full and they're like doing chores and errands. And like, if you think about the medium, like it's really helpful and really important, I think, as the host of a podcast, especially an interview show where you're talking to people who you don't know, to like provide this really good narrative structure so people don't get lost. So I think about, most of my episodes, if I'm just like interviewing someone who's got like a story to tell, I think about, okay, in the very beginning, I need to give this person a good introduction that gives you a reason why, you're going to learn from this episode. And then after that, I want to start the conversation on like a really high point, just something that's really interesting, that's going to get you hooked from the beginning. And then after you start to care, then I go back to the very beginning of their story, not at the very beginning, but like I make sure I've gotten you hooked before I go to the beginning of their story. And then I'm talking them through these questions. And often like what'll happen is I'll ask somebody a question and they'll just like tell their entire life story. And I need to like pull it back and like essentially provide the narrative glue and kind of almost sometimes repeat what they're saying, just so listeners know where we are in the story and what the point of things are. So I think about the narrative structure a lot, just sort of putting the guide rails on the conversation. I think about the density of insights, or sometimes just I refer to as insights per minute. I got this from Sonal, who hosts the A16Z podcast. But like, if you don't have a show where you're just a huge personality and people love you and you could talk about nothing for like 3 hours and people would still listen, which like I don't, I had to talk about something, then the opposite sort of thing to aim for in my perspective is just insights. Like, what new ideas and helpful information are you bringing to your audience? And like, how frequently are you giving them these dopamine hits? And obviously they should like ideally be substantive and like helpful, which means you need to understand like what it is that your audience is listening for and like what they get out of the show. But once you understand that, you can kind of engineer your show to try to maximize that. And so what I've done a lot often with my guests is I'll have a pre-conversation with my guests. I'll bring them on like a couple weeks beforehand and just ask them questions, kind of like, what are the high points in your story? Like, what was the time you felt really scared? What was the time you thought things weren't going to work? What was like the biggest celebration you had? What's the hardest thing you learned? What's the most unintuitive thing? And I try to get like all the facts for all the inflection points in their story. So then we actually have the real conversation. I kind of know what insights they have to offer, what types of things will be interesting. And I'll also do my own research and bring my own stories and facts that I researched to the conversation, just so that as a listener, you're like, oh, I learned so much from this episode. And now you're more likely to go share it with a friend because like you've got some hook, something that you learned that you want to tell your friend about. So those are like two of the big things.
I'll cut in here real quick. And I was like thinking of like, Cortland's been talking for a little bit, but like I need to like keep letting him talk. And as you mentioned the insights per minute, I was like, that's what he's doing. You're like you've got it like a habit. I can tell you kind of like you had an insight after an insight after an insight. So and I'm becoming even more conscious about my interview process as you talk through it, right? Giving people an anchor to what they just listened to, and taking a step back and giving perspectives. Those are really useful things. And I really appreciate that you're able to make them conscious, because I think probably some of these things people do intuitively and it makes for a good show, but they're not able to communicate it. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time early on not knowing why some of my episodes were downloaded more than others. And it's still a mystery sometimes, where episodes I think are going to do well don't, and vice versa. But I'm obviously in the process of trying to figure it out.
Is there something that you tried, and Rob, if you have a comment, you can say it in a minute. If there's something that you tried to make the quality better that you found a waste of time, so everybody's going to go out there and they're going to try things to improve their quality, but any advice on what's kind of a bad direction or you found useless or a waste of time?
Yeah, I think early on, I was a little bit more wedded to like so there's a few things that I've tried that didn't last very long. Like, for example, like I'd heard the suggestion, like, don't prepare any questions in advance. You should be learning the same time as all the listeners are learning. And that's what makes an episode engaging. And I found that to be like the exact opposite of what works for at least me in particular, because then it was hard for me to figure out, okay, what is the narrative structure of this conversation? I don't even know where this guest is going to go. It was harder for me to figure out what insights there are going to be. I've had the exact opposite effect for like, I spent a lot of time preparing for episodes, a lot of time researching guests, coming up with really good questions. And it's not that I want to read the questions off like verbatim during the episode. That also I found leads to sort of a stilted conversation, which I think is like really bad for quality. I think people just like naturally want to listen to like really smooth like conversations where people have good chemistry, and they end up like dropping episodes where it seems like the conversation is stilted or awkward, which can often happen if you're like reading questions from a list like a robot. So that also like doesn't work particularly well, even though you might be able to come up with really good questions. Usually the best questions are just like follow-up questions that show you're listening to what the person is saying, or often not even questions, just like repeating back to them what they said, but like in your own words, and then they'll riff off of that. And it seems like a very like high chemistry, very naturally flowing, pleasant conversation. So
Yeah, being present, I think, is kind of, that's the thing. If you have written questions, you can look at them. So the downfall is you can look at the next question, waiting for them to finish their answer, and you're not
Yeah,
listening to their answer.
exactly.
Yeah.
And you're always like kind of thinking about like the next question, because you're kind of thinking about the narrative flow. So they're talking, you're trying to listen to them, but you have to think about, okay, well, if I don't have something to riff off of this, what am I going to talk about next? Which is kind of the challenge. And while you're probably, if you do an interview, you're probably very tired after the end of it. But like, you're completely right. Like, it's better to be in the moment and err on the side of like listening to what they're saying and being flexible.
I'll call out something interesting that I've come across in the past few years. There's a movement called authentic relating, and they also call it circling. And it's kind of a thing that's been evolving over the past few years, at least in my world. And it's really just an exercise. It's an exercise in training for being present and like being able to have a conversation with another person, which goes deep, and it has to do with making eye contact and what you observe about them. And so it's, if you're looking for ways to get more engaged in a conversation, it might be an interesting resource.
What's it called?
Rob, authentic relating is also called circling, depending on the context you do it in.
Cool.
And they call them like communication exercises, connection exercises, but it can be very fun and like a community oriented thing. I don't know if it's great for quarantine, but you can do it over Zoom calls too. Rob, did you have something you want to contribute? I noticed you unmuted yourself a couple of times.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I've done a lot of interviews too over the years, and it just seems like finding those unique insights are not easy. I mean, I think I think a lot of podcasters get started and they think that doing this stuff is easy. My experience is that the best conversations are ones that the host has done deep research on their guests and has deep understanding of what makes them tick, and then creates an outline, but doesn't stick to the outline. The outline for me has always been a way to remind me of things that I found in the deep research.
Yeah.
But it may not be something that I say verbatim. What was written on the page, it's more of like a reminder that these are areas, but like you were saying, keeping in the present and listening, and also doing some, I don't know if this is what you were trying to say, Ethan, but the reflecting is also sometimes good to do too, where you confirm to your guests that you heard what they said, right? So you're almost like repeating back part of what they said to them, and then digging deeper, and that'll actually create a deeper connection with their audience that as well, that's listening too. So because that proves to your audience that you're engaged with that guest.
Rob, I'll just let you know you're not coming through your actual mic. We could hear you, but it's really, your audio is low, so you can try to address that.
You're right. I've got too many microphones here.
There you go.
Yeah, I had to plugged into the wrong microphone. Sorry.
Yeah, he's too involved in the media field.
Yeah,
he's got too many things around.
So anyway, could you hear what I said?
Yeah, we
could hear
Okay.
it. It was just a little thin.
Right.
I'll recommend another resource. Chris Voss wrote a book on. He's an FBI hostage negotiator, and he wrote a few books. And you made me think of an interesting technique he has with actual hostage negotiation. But he'll tell you it works with all sorts of interactions. Is to repeat the last 3 or 4 words that somebody says and frame it as a question. You know, so they said, "Oh, I went to the store yesterday." "Oh, so you went to the store yesterday?" You know, and then
Tell us more about that.
Yeah,
frame it as a question.
Yeah. Frame it as a question, right? Frame it as a question. So it's interesting. It's a simple but very useful technique for engaging with someone.
Yeah. If you can get the guests to like you like a friend and to connect at that level, I think was it Tony Robbins is the one that teaches that technique of mirroring, right? Just like what you said, and it builds a relationship with your guest, and that could also be something that's done in a pre-interview too. I don't know if Cortland, if you've done pre-interviews or not.
Yeah, I love doing pre-interviews, and it's to back up the point that you made earlier, like doing a lot of research and creating this outline, I found is good, because then it just gives you the knowledge you need to have a good conversation with your guest. Even if you're not sticky, you throw the outline out, just like the process of having done that, suddenly you can riff off of each other, and like they just have a lot better rapport with you because they're like, oh, this person knows what they're talking about and they understand the subject matter. And I think especially if you have an interview-based show, I think people underestimate the degree to which like the quality of that show is going to be very directly related to your guest. Like you can be a great interviewer, but like you're only like half the equation, probably much less than that. So I think picking really good guests and taking the time to know like what they feel comfortable talking about is super helpful. And that's why I like the pre-interview, because it gives me a really good chance to feel them out and be like, oh, they really like talking about this subject. Like we should talk about this.
Yeah, and I think it's also important too, because it maintains the integrity of the relationship of the audience with the host too. Because then you're confirming to your listeners that you're probably almost as much as an expert as your guest. And that keeps them coming back week over week, because listeners come back to listen to the host primarily. I believe anyway, and you want to create that environment. The folks that have said in the past that you basically turn over the interview to the guest is, I think, a mistake in podcasting, because then people are just coming in to hear the guest and not hear the host. And that's where if you want to keep listeners coming back every week, you got to have them connect to you, the host.
Yeah.
Yeah, Cortland, I definitely can give you compliments on being a host. I really hear that when you're in that respect, especially, you have kind of that indie hacker mindset that you know the questions that the indie hacker wants to ask. You're not asking them from the perspective of, so talk to the other, multi-billion-dollar CEOs of VC-funded startups, and tell them about this or that, or tell people.
Right.
No, it's like, okay, frame this towards the indie hacker mindset. I find that very valuable. When you were talking about insights per minute and the pre-interview and the notes, I know you shared with me something individually that I found very useful. You talked about how you are currently, and maybe have been for a while, focusing on trends that are going on and trying to incorporate those. So it's almost like, it seems like, as I'm listening, it seems like in moments you'll have maybe notes about trends that might apply to that particular guest. And then you'll just say, hey, there's a trend in XYZ, da, 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 and give them a chance to talk about that. So any more you could say about that?
Yeah, totally. So Rob made a good point, which is that like, why do people come back to your show? If you want to grow your download numbers, like that's not merely attracting new listeners, but it's keeping your old listeners coming back. And one of the things that I think happens often with educational shows is listeners graduate the same way they graduate from like educational institutions. They're like, great, I've learned everything I need to learn. I don't need to listen to another 50 episodes. That show was great. And like, that's cool to have that effect on people, but like ideally they would keep listening. And so I think you need to think it's important to consider the kind of value that you provide to listeners and whether or not the problem you're solving for them or the desire you're fulfilling is something that's like an ongoing thing, or whether it's something that's very short-lived and they just needed like a few lessons on it and they're done. Like I listened to a podcast called Manager Tools to help me with management. And like I finished, like I'm done with it. But one of the easiest ways to provide ongoing value for people, especially if they're in a particular industry where they need to stay informed, is to just literally help keep them informed. We all have like a ton of news coming at us constantly. And like, we just don't have time to be bookworms and to constantly read up on like every detail of everything, right? Like people who listen to Any Hackers might be behind on any number of topics. They might not understand what GPT-3 is. It might be behind on cryptocurrency. They might have missed the newsletter trend, et cetera. But if you can, for example, constantly do that research for them and explain to them new concepts and why it matters and what's going on in the world, then instead of having like these like evergreen interviews where I'm just getting these stories from entrepreneurs over and over and they like kind of start to blur together, you're kind of also listening because like it keeps you up to date. It makes you better at your job. And there's no real end date. There's never a time where you're like, I don't want to be up to date anymore, or very few people have that. And so I think it just reduces churn. It gives your listeners a lot more like actionable, useful insights that they can take with them. So I think that's kind of an important thing that I didn't discover until probably around this time last year. I started looking at a lot of the bigger shows, and like very often they have like a news hook component. They talk about current events and things that are important to people. And there's a quick secondary benefit of this is that, if you want your show to grow, a lot of growth in the podcast space is through word of mouth. Like content marketing is great, but often when people are reading content on their phones or their computers, are not in a place to just like immediately start listening to an episode. And so word of mouth is huge. And so when you can discuss topics that are literally remarkable, as in like people want to remark on them to others, your show just grows faster. People just talk about it, right? If you talk about a current event that people are already talking about to their friends, then they'll bring up your show or whatever you've written or published and say, oh, I heard this on this podcast, blah, blah, blah. And like, that's a good way for your show to grow. So I think there's like kind of a double benefit to finding some way to like naturally incorporate trends or current events into whatever you're talking about.
Yeah, we had a episode recently where a guest came on, and our guests bring on new business ideas, and he had a business idea around social currencies. And I was like, okay, I know about social currency. Like, I've got social currency with this person and this person, but there's literally now anyone can start a cryptocurrency or a currency. I don't know if it's crypto, whatever. They can start a currency that is tied to their personality.
Yeah.
And, people can trade it and use it. And I remember that both during that episode and as I re-listened to it later to review it, I was like, this is fascinating. I want to go look this up, and that's also happened to me, especially recently with some of your episodes. I noticed there's a couple of topics like newsletters, that has come up quite a few times.
Yeah.
And you'll talk about, oh, there's a lot of people making money from newsletters. This is very interesting. Who knew that you could make some money from creating a newsletter? And so now I'm like looking these things up, and I feel like that for me, that seems like part of this idea of something that's both remarkable and current, trendy is if you in the middle of the episode, you go, just a second, I got to pause it. I just want to look that up real quick. I feel like that kind of counts for that kind of content, right?
Totally. And there's news, which might be like an event that just happened this week, which is fine. Like, you can talk about that. And then there's like trends, which I think of as like broader, like the trend of people making money off of email newsletters has been kind of picking up steam since like last October and really began hitting full stride like a few months ago. And like, you can do tons of episodes that are like related to particular trends. And so I think identifying trends and then having like particular news related to trends, like, oh, wow, The Hustle, Sam Parr just got to $20 million in recurring revenue, and he just has 8 people on staff writing a newsletter. Like, that's remarkable. And it's, like you said, a trend. So it's both of those things in one. And there's always new trends. It's always a source of new content, which is super helpful because you don't have to be as extremely, creative. It also helps with guest selection because you can find, I can scope, the interview, the guests that I'm looking for, the entrepreneurs, to people who are related to these particular trends. And there's still a huge variety because at any given time, there's like 10 or 20 trends that are worth talking about. And they always kind of shuffle in and out.
So I want to jump back a little bit because I've had some of the people involved in this group are interested in the whole idea of building an email list. And I know it's sort of all wrapped in to everything right now, the email side of things. But I noticed when I looked back on your Indie Hackers profile, and that's really what's cool about Indie Hackers too. Like, when people keep track of their progress, you can see the things they're focused on. So you were focused, one of the things you were focused on was building an email list before you were building the podcast. Any remembrances or tips from the early days of how to kind of build that list and get people engaged?
Yeah. I mean, it's like, I wasn't super strategic about it, or I wasn't super tactical about it. I think the strategy is like pretty simple, right? For email, like, it's content. People want good content in their email inboxes. And for that, like, I did kind of what I mentioned earlier. I would work backwards. I found out like what content are people already consuming online about this particular subject matter. Like, I'm not the first person to ever interview entrepreneurs. I should go look at other people who've done it and see like, what are they sharing a lot? What are they upvoting a lot? And then try to, like, I made like a list of all the commonalities between like the stories that people really liked versus the stories that people didn't like. And then I made sure that like my stories always had those elements that people liked. And then it was just a matter of like publishing them regularly, submitting them to like the right channels where my particular audience lived. So for me, that was Hacker News. It's like this huge forum where all these like software engineers who like are kind of startup minded hang out. And it's like a ton of traffic if you can get to the top of Hacker News. And my growth strategy early on was to get to the top of Hacker News like once a month, twice a month, which worked reliably because I was producing content that was like tailor made for people on that particular channel to share. If I decided that my channel was Twitter or a particular subreddit or SEO, then my content would be like formatted differently to appeal to those particular visitors and where they're coming from and the mindset that they're in. But it was tailored towards Hacker News. And then from there was like put an email call to action on every single page. And I could have been more aggressive. Like, I could have had exit intent pop-ups, or I could have like, hidden some content where you had to sign up for the newsletter, but I didn't. And so the newsletter like grew, but it wasn't like as aggressive as it could have been. But it still grew to the point where like, by the end of the first year, it was like 30 or 40,000 subscribers. And that was huge for me because it's like an audience that I own. Like, an email list is great. No one can take that away from you. You can always communicate with them at whatever schedule that you want.
going to put a link in the chat here for anybody who wants to review. So you can go and look at Cortland's progress, what he's posted about it on the Indie Hackers website. I thought that was kind of useful. You also mentioned that early on, you did have advertising. So you don't have advertising now because you've been acquired by Stripe. So I'm assuming they're just gonna shower you with money and gifts and just do whichever you like. But
kind of like that.
But no, I'm sure it's complicated. But in terms of you did have advertisers initially, right? Or you had revenue. So where was your revenue coming from earlier on, and how did you set that up?
Yeah, there's another thing that was like I was kind of lucky with, where like just so happened that my target audience is like these software engineers and startup founders, like have a lot of money, and there are a lot of companies that want to advertise to them as a result. And so I initially started off by like in my newsletter, like putting a blank spot where an ad could be and saying, hey, your ad could be here. And I ended up talking to a lot of people on the indie hackers list, kind of like who were running their own companies and wanted to get the word out to other indie hackers and entrepreneurs. And that went so-so. I was selling ads for like $100 or $150 per newsletter. But I found that like as I kind of moved up market to, bigger and bigger companies, it was just way better. Like when I sold ads to like really small, early stage companies, the founders were a lot more nervous. Like, is the ad going to work? And it was like a big spend for them, and they needed every click to count, and they would complain about lots of stuff. And then I would feel bad if their ad didn't work very well. Whereas like eventually I started selling to like bigger companies like SparkPost, for example, which is like one of the number one senders of transactional email on the web. And like selling an ad to them was like emailing somebody from their marketing department that I found on LinkedIn and just saying, hey, I run this thing. Here's our audience. I think it would be good for you. Let me know if you're interested. Got back to me the next week because there's someone like at SparkPost whose job it is to spend money on ads. And like, that's literally her entire role. So she's like, great, thanks for helping me do my job. Hopped on the phone. She talked about like her kids and her vacation, and then like wrote me a check for like 10 grand for like a month of ads. I'm like, wow, that was way, way better than dealing with the really, really tiny companies. Way less work. So ended up getting acquired by Stripe like pretty quickly into that process. I didn't go super deep with it. But like that was my biggest takeaway, like talk to bigger companies. And it was good to practice on like sort of like, these test cases, but like moving forward, it was just way easier to make bigger deals. Somewhat counterintuitively.
So at that point, when you got a check for $10,000, was that mostly due to your email list or your podcast? Was this for podcast advertising, sort of newsletter advertising, both? Like, how did that work?
It was like
out?
all of the above. So it's like I would put an ad on my website and our newsletter and the podcast and sell you like a package and be like, you're going to be in, 4 newsletters, and you're going to be on the homepage, and you're going to be in every podcast episode for the next month. And it was just, that was it, like all together package deal, which is super easy.
Right. Got it. So what I want to come in here was, so we have people come to this group are, relative beginners to podcasting.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about your story is I think at the moment you were just like, I guess I was kind of lucky in that case.
Yeah.
Right? There's a lot of things that kind of like unfolded. Like you didn't reach out to Stripe, they reached out to you. It's just kind of like, oh, it's magic. It's great. I mean, and I'm sure there's difficult parts, but what I'd love for you to do is just take a moment, because I know, you had difficult moments with other projects, at least. I think this one's probably a little bit easier. Can you talk to the respective kind of, the things that didn't go well for you, maybe even before Indie Hackers, how that informs how you'd approach this and how you move forward?
Yeah. I had a lot of things that didn't go well, even at Indie Hackers. But beforehand, I was like the stereotypical software engineer who I just loved building stuff and creating stuff. And if I told you an idea, I was just going to tell you all about like all the bells and whistles I was going to add to make it cool. And like, I wasn't doing any like the boring business stuff. Like I didn't have a business plan. I was never like doing market research. Like I didn't look into how I was going to sell any of the stuff that I built. And I built a lot of stuff over a lot of years that quite frankly, like nobody wanted. And I was so sure in my mind that people were going to want it because it just seemed so cool. But like I would put it out there, and it was just like, some people kind of sort of liked it, and then a totally different customer kind of sort of liked it for different reasons. And I never really got anything to the point where it really took off and I knew what to do with it, if that makes sense. Like I was working on like a productivity app before Indie Hackers, where it was kind of like this to-do list that would sit inside your Gmail inbox. And like, I could not have told you who my ideal customer was, because like everyone used it in different ways for different reasons, which made it impossible for me to figure out like what features I should build or like what direction I should go in. And so after like years of basically doing that and like creating companies that sort of failed, my approach when I started Indie Hackers was to like start with all the boring stuff, start the way that like every business book would tell you to start, like think about the problems before you encounter them later because they're somewhat predictable. And so like for me, I think the hardest thing was just like choosing a really specific customer, like excluding everybody else. Like for me in the beginning, it's like, if you're not a software engineer, Indie Hackers is not for you, because there's going to be a lot of discussion of code. If you're not trying to start a startup right now, Indie Hackers is not for you, because we're going to get into the nitty gritty and it's not just inspirational stories. And that felt really crappy because it was like, well, there's all these people who I could potentially reach and I'm excluding them. But it turned out to be like the biggest thing that I'd ever done by far, because the people who I did reach like shared it tremendously with everybody that was just like them. And there were enough of them that it was still a big market anyway. And so I think that was one of the biggest lessons I learned, which is like, you know, you just got to suck it up and pick a target market and make something really, really good for them. I think that's also why Stripe bought Indie Hackers. They're like, yeah, it's a really small team, but like Cortland is like clearly doing a good job and everything he's doing seems to be high quality. And like, that was also a side effect of me in the past, like trying to do way too much and code way too much and then having these super expansive like plans and designs and making all these complex stuff, which meant that I did everything kind of like to a mediocre degree, you know, like I'd make a feature, but it like wasn't really designed that well. Whereas with Indie Hackers, it was like I literally just made a blog and I felt like crap making a blog, because like I'm a software engineer. I could code way better, more impressive stuff than just a blog. But because I limited the scope of what I wanted to build to this really small thing, I could make it like super good, like way better than every other blog, because it's literally all I was doing. And I think like that attention to detail, it's better to be deep and really good than it is to be like really broad but really shallow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like if it sounds like you channeled your obsessiveness with kind of quality and try to put it all in one direction. It's like, yeah,
Exactly.
you can code it because Indie Hackers, you know, like you said, you just started with the blog, but what's cool about Indie Hackers, it's got its own feel. And I've heard you talk about this, I think before, like, okay, it's like a dark colored site, you know, and
yeah,
you made choices about how you wanted the design of it and the feel of it to be. And it seems like you channeled your distractible energy into like, okay, let me just kind of tweak this thing and make it better from the angles that
I think that's
are interesting me.
That's the perfect way to describe it. I think almost anything you do has like a lot of depth to it. And you might think something simple, but if like that's the only thing that you're focusing on, you'll realize there's a crazy amount of depth and you can go super deep. And like the design of Indie Hackers, like most websites I'd made in the past, I was like, oh, this looks good, it's fine. But Indie Hackers is like, I literally have nothing else to do. I sent out a bunch of emails for interview requests. What am I going to do? I guess I can make the website look better. And it's like, oh, like this is a whole rabbit hole I could go down for like months if I wanted to. And it's like, I made it dark just to make it look different than every other website. And I read all these like books on branding and standing out, and like choosing the name was another rabbit hole that I spent a while on. And I think just having the time to actually go deep on all that stuff really was a huge difference maker.
Were there other I'm curious, like when you started Indie Hackers, the months or years or whatever before you actually made that decision, I'm going to focus, were there other niches that you were kind of like, at what point did you differentiate? What were some of the other niches that you were interested in pursuing?
Indie Hackers was the first thing after I like decided to get, I basically like took a year off work because I was contracting and working on stuff on the side. And then one of my contracts ended and I was like, well, I've got like a year of runway saved up. Living in San Francisco like an idiot, spending way too much on rent. Like I could have just moved somewhere cheap and had like 3 years of runway. But I just like messed around for 6 months, just like coding on whatever I thought was fun to code. And then I looked up and like half my bank account was gone. And it's like, wow, I'm just going to waste all of my money doing nothing, like repeating all these mistakes. And that was like the impetus for me to be like, okay, I've been doing this for years. Like, let me be rigorous and like write down all the mistakes that I've made, all the advice that I've heard, and just like actually just follow it and be disciplined. Even though it's not the most fun thing, like just do it. And then I started Indie Hackers as a result of that. But I had like 3 or 4 days of just like rigorous brainstorming and like trying to come up with ideas and trying to figure out what to work on in the beginning. I didn't do any of those because the best idea was Indie Hackers itself.
Is that part of the reason that you were resistant to starting a podcast? Because I remember you said other people were saying you want to start a podcast. Were you thinking, no, I don't want to do that because I want to focus on the blog? Like that's the thing. Was that part of it or not?
No, it's podcasting just didn't seem like fun at all. It seemed like a endless treadmill of thankless work like you have to show up for every week. And I just wanted to code something that would just run in the background magically while I'm like sipping on coffee. So I just didn't think it was fun. Didn't seem interesting to me, you know, and I had already felt like with the interviews I was doing for the blog, I had gotten to the point where I'd pretty much automated them. Like I would send people questions, they would send me responses, I'd send follow-up questions, and I was like, oh, this is exhausting. So then I would send questions and I have a bunch of bullet points under the questions. Like, by the way, I often remind people to think about this, this, and this. And after like 2 months of doing that, my question template was like 10 questions, which had like 30 bullet points each under them of like all the different things that you should answer with. And I never had to send follow-ups. People would just give me back a good interview. So it's like, oh, I've got this down to the point where it's like an automated, like one-click interview, and it's really good. And I didn't see a good way to do that with a podcast because I have to actually be there. So I was just being lazy and I didn't want to do a podcast.
Got it. That's is that a style that you like picked up from somebody else in terms of kind of help like letting an audience sort of create content in conjunction with you or collaboration with you? Because it seems like a great way if you're not super into creating the content yourself and saying that you're the expert. Did you find that someplace else? And
I was always
other people could use that model.
Averse to, some people really like the limelight, like it just depends on your personality. Like my community manager, Rosie, she's awesome. She has her own newsletter. She's called it like Rosie Land. She's named it after herself. She just likes the limelight a lot more than I do, to be honest. Like some people, like their website is named after them, like Pat Flynn. He's got a ton of followers and it's just like his face plastered to the front. And I'm like the exact opposite. Like I would be happy if no one knew who I was and everything was working without me. And that seems like a lot chiller and easier to me, to be honest. I remember watching Nathan Barry, like who's the owner of ConvertKit, like growing his email list and writing his blog years before I started Indie Hackers, and literally thinking like, wow, this is so helpful. And also like, I'm getting exhausted looking at how much work he's doing, writing all of these newsletters and blog posts. Like it just seems exhausting. And so when I started Indie Hackers, like I had my whole plan mapped out for the first 6 months. And a huge part of it was like, I don't have to do a ton of work because I'm interviewing people, which means they're the ones who have most of the insights, which is cool. Huge burden off my shoulder. I don't have to be like super creative and come up with all these crazy stories. Like I'm going to create an internet forum so everybody can ask each other questions and respond and help each other out. And then again, like I don't have to do anything. Everybody's helping each other. And so like, I'm just kind of the creator of this space where everyone can help each other rather than me being like the person who has to be, the Gary V coming up with like new creative, innovative concepts every single day, endlessly forever.
And so it seems like it's kind of possible, right? It seems like, I think that's sort of the dream for you is to have it be a hands-off type of thing. And it seems like in some ways you've had a success at that, because that's kind of what you have. I can go on Indie Hackers and I can do stuff and you just can be doing a podcast interview. But you've also found ways in which you maybe decided you needed to or wanted to engage more. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. Like I actually do. Like, it turns out I like having a podcast. I didn't think I was going to like it. And it's like, now that I've done it, I'm like, oh, I was dumb. It's actually pretty fun. We just get to talk to interesting, cool people all the time. Like, can't believe that's actually a job. I like writing code. Like, as you can see, Indie Hackers is much more complex than its early days when it was just a blog. Like, that's like, I would do that for free on my own as a hobby. So it's, I guess the company sort of turned into something where like, I get to luckily do a lot of the things that I just enjoy doing. In whatever proportion that I like to do them. But I could also, like, if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, like the website would keep going. So it doesn't need me, but like, I guess I help accelerate it, which is a good place to be.
Right. That sounds good. Just how many episodes before you decided that you actually like podcasting? Just curious.
It's ebbed and flowed, to be honest. Like, I think I've always liked podcasting in general. There are times where I'm really excited about some code that I'm writing and I really want to build, like, an Indie Hackers, just this whole directory of products. And now it's like 12,000 people have put a product on here. And most of them have like added a timeline of all their accomplishments and stuff. And you can sort by revenue. I remember building that. It took like 3 months and I just did not want to do any podcasting. Like, I took a hiatus from the podcast because I was like, I just want to get this out the door. I just want it to be done. And like, in hindsight, like, I shouldn't have done that because taking a hiatus just crushes your download numbers. And it's like, you have to kind of work back from like it reset me like a few months earlier. And that's kind of how I learned the lesson. Like, oh, I guess consistency is really important. And when you start missing episodes, like, people unsubscribe or they kick you out of their queue or they replace you with something else. But like, at that point in time, if you had asked me, I'd been like, nah, podcast isn't that fun. Coding is what's fun. Now I have like a really healthy, like, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday podcast days. I think about nothing but the podcast in those days, like Thursday, Friday. And then if I work it all on the weekend, like, that's when I'm doing other stuff. And it's a really healthy balance where, like, by the time like I'm done with my podcast days, I'm super excited to code or whatever. And by the time I'm done coding, I'm super excited to get back to the podcast. So I think it took me maybe a year to get there.
Okay. Interesting. I'll take a minute just to remind people there's going to be another session next week. Cortland won't be here, but we'll follow up on kind of what he talked about. Trying to, some action steps that you can take based on, I think, what we've talked about here, and we can even discuss if there's others, but I really like this idea of researching your upcoming guests from the mindset of trends. So
Yeah.
it's not just finding out things about them, but how can you ask them questions so that in the midst of the podcast, you're having them or yourself comment on or speak to a trend. I think that's a good assignment for people to give a shot at. And I guess another thing would be in your next episode recording to use some strategy. It doesn't have to be one of the ones that we pointed out, of this kind of a strategy to help you really engage more with the person you're talking to, whether it's repeating the last couple of words that they said and asking a question, or taking some other approach. I think that could be really useful to bring as a focus. And then next week when we meet, we can discuss those things in more detail and bring more from the hosts in terms of our experience of that. Anybody from the other hosts want to jump in or give any comments or say anything? And also other people that are attending, if you want to, you can start writing notes in the chat or hop in and throw in a comment if you want. You should be able to unmute yourself. I saw your hand. Was that Henry?
Raising my hand in class.
Okay.
There is a question I'm sure you'll catch from Chris DeFerio in the chat. But first of all, well worth my time here today, Cortland. So thank you for sharing. This has been a valuable use of my time.
Thank you.
At a tactical level, I'm just curious, all the things that you've talked about that go into producing an episode. Talk to me a little bit more about your editing process. And the bigger question I'm getting to is how much effort goes into producing an episode for you?
Yeah. So an episode is kind of like a constant amount of just like researching topics and trends. Like I try to do that every like other day or two, just like read through Twitter, read through the news, read through these newsletters I subscribe to. I have a whole document where I talk about topics and trends. And then from that, figure out, okay, which guests, like which people keep coming up over and over, or who's doing interesting things. I'll often do that research on Indie Hackers itself. So like I would say like just to pick a particular guest, it's probably a good hour and a half of work just reading. Then, kind of like send out information. Usually people say yes to come on the show. Then I'll spend like another 2 hours or so just like researching, like what should I talk to this person about? Let me get like deep into what's going on with them. Quick 20-minute like prep call they'll sign up for, which is usually just like, usually my goal on the prep call is just to get to know them, get comfortable with them, and also like find out two things. Number one, what do they like talking about? Like what are they really good at talking about? And I'll have some guesses, but I want to kind of confirm that. So I'll ask them like some really tactical questions and see if they get really deep into the tactics. And if they don't, then I'm like, oh, I should probably stay away from that during the episode, et cetera. And the other variable I always want to know is like, how long-winded are they? If I ask them a question, are they going to go for like 20 minutes? Or are they going to go for like, 10 seconds? Because that helps me calibrate like how the show is going to go. Then pretty much nothing happens until I might update my notes a little bit, but then we actually record. I block off an hour and 15 minutes for recording. Usually we just kind of like relax and talk for 5 or 10 minutes before we start recording. And then I don't really record an intro with them there. I just try to like smoothly just start asking questions and go into it. So they don't even know when the episode's really started. That takes an hour. Then I'll do an editing pass, which I will put it into like Adobe Audition, both of our files, and it lets you kind of speed up the timeline. So I'll play it at like 2x speed and I'll listen through and I'll just leave markers where I think there's anything that like needs to be changed. And then I'll ship it off to like my actual editor. So I use a studio called Record Edit Podcast, and they'll do like, the intro music and put my outro in there and like cut out ums and ahs and make us both sound pretty good. So that takes zero time on my part. And then I'll just editorialize the episode, come up with a title and a description, and put it out there. So maybe it's almost like a full day of work, really, to get like a whole episode done.
It's a tremendous investment. I mean, that's a lot of time for an episode.
Yeah.
But as far as getting that flow, that narrative structure you were talking about, so do you then actively edit? Like if it is a long-winded story,
Right.
Do you try to edit that down? Do you reposition content? You said, you like to start with that hook.
Yep.
Or does that come as a result of what you're doing live in the recording of it? And there's not much post-editing to get that.
Mostly live, some post-editing. Like there's an episode I did recently with this guy, Drew Riley, and everyone loved it. But there was like a good part of the episode where I asked him a question and he just didn't have an answer. And then he was really embarrassed about not having an answer for that part. But then later on, he was like, oh, I have an answer to your earlier question. And he like said it. And then like, I was like, well, this is like awkward because you wanted me to cut that part out where you're embarrassed. But then I just in editing kind of moved his later answer. And like, luckily it sounded good and natural and no one could tell. But that would say that only happens like once every 5 or so episodes. And I think my actual editors will often cut an episode down from like an hour and 10 minutes to an hour but like a lot of that's just like silences, ums and ahs, sometimes like repetitive stuff, not a whole lot of like rearranging things to put them in like a different narrative order.
Yeah. So one of the things I've always struggled with, because I put a lot of time into the research, I don't do a pre-interview. We can get into that later, my thoughts on that. But I've always struggled with, can I delegate any of that? And I don't think that I can.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts there?
I think it must be possible because there are such big podcast studios and shows that do delegate it, right? Like, I don't think Guy Raz is like, sitting down at Adobe Audition or whatever, marking everything. I think he just works with like a really good producer. I have not found a really good producer, but admittedly, I haven't spent a lot of time trying to do it. There are some people in like the podcast network who have producers. Like Ethan, I think you have a producer, right? Yeah, and she seems to have...
we just brought on Ari, who was actually our first guest for this particular mastermind, and she also edits the and produces the Mixergy podcast. So they have some great success in the business space. So it's a good I'll hesitate to use the word marriage because she's female, but that's the first word that comes to mind. But like, we work really well together too. I think it's nice to have an editor, like a producer that cares about your show. I think it's probably really rare to find that, but someone who actually cares about the topics and
exactly
wants to.
I just don't know. I mean, I get how that would help. It's got to be difficult because that preparation that you're putting in is then what facilitates what you're doing when you're recording the episode, right?
Yep.
So I don't know how, even if you had a producer, I can see where they can help you with some of it, but you still have to digest that information to prepare you to have the great interview.
Yep.
Yeah.
Of course. I mean, ultimately the recording is, and like the learning is in your hands. But I do think like if you get a producer or an editor who like understands the subject matter really well, they're naturally interested in it, and they're skilled with like all the actual tools, and you're like, you have enough trust to be able to hand an episode off to them and trust that they have good taste, I think they can do a lot in post. And like maybe they even have access to sort of like your research on the episode and what you wanted to accomplish and what you thought the outline was going to be like, which might make them help, understand what you're going for. I think that the second one in that list is the one I've struggled with the most, which is like finding someone who's great at podcast editing and who like understands like all the jargon and conversation and topics that I'm talking about in my particular episodes, because otherwise they might cut out stuff they think is unimportant, that's like super important, or that's like crucial and like it doesn't register to them. So I think like there's a certain level of like responsibility you can't really abdicate as the host, but also like there are people with very successful shows who must be outsourcing a lot of this and doing it quite successfully.
Yeah. Great stuff. Thanks.
I want to jump in here with Chris's comment here. He said, how have you been able to most accurately assess the needs of your audience today? Surveys, ? Also, how do you weave in those needs into your interviews?
Yeah. So for me, like I've done a lot of surveys, and a lot of this I did before I even had a podcast. And a lot of the problems that like early stage entrepreneurs have are pretty evergreen, right? People don't know how to fund their businesses. People don't know how to come up with ideas. Like there's certain hurdles that are just super common and that are just evergreen. And then beyond that, what I like to do, and like you see a lot of those coming up time and time again in the survey answers. I also like have a survey that automatically goes out to people who subscribe to Indie Hackers' newsletter or sign up for the website like a month after they join. So it's like a constant sort of like just windfall of like survey responses to that. But a lot of that doesn't change over time. I should perhaps like start asking what trends are you most interested in and add that to the survey. But beyond like talking to people, I think one of the best things that you can do, and that's worked really well for me, is just like looking for proof. Because often when you ask people stuff, like they don't know, but when you look at how people spend their time, like it's proof positive, like, oh, this is what people care about, right? Like what shows are getting a lot of downloads, which episodes of those shows are getting a lot of downloads. Like I can look at This Week in Startups with Jason Calacanis and see which YouTube videos of his have like 10 times more views than other ones and be like, oh, what's going on here? Was it like a really high energy, exciting guest that made it, big? Or was it like a topic that like is super charged, et cetera? And like that can help inform me. And like that's like proof positive. Or if I go on the Indie Hackers website and see like what topics people are, like I can click to see like what are the top discussions that were had like last week or the week before that or last month. And like that's also proof positive. Like even though nobody would suggest that in a survey, like, oh, I really want to talk about this topic, I can see that it keeps coming up over and over again. So people clearly do want to talk about this particular topic. So that'll help me usually in terms of like guest selection and topic selection. And then like the kind of more broad evergreen stuff comes into play when I'm asking questions and going through someone's story. Like I always want to figure out how they came up with their idea and how they knew it was a good idea, and just kind of focus on the problems that like most listeners are really struggling with, or like if they haven't gotten started yet, like that they anticipate struggling with, that's stopping them from starting a business. And that doesn't change very much.
Is that a good answer, Chris? If you have any follow-up, you're welcome to chime in and ask.
Yeah, thank you for that. Hopefully, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep,
Okay, good.
Great.
I guess a follow-up question would be the picking places to go for that information. You mentioned going to somebody's YouTube channel, but so many different people to choose from. I suppose
Totally.
you have to pick someone whose audience you share, but knowing who that is, I guess, is the trick.
Yes, I've done there's a lot of posts. I mean, I have like an unfair hack because Indie Hackers is a community, and there's literally like 300,000 discussions that have happened in the last 4 years, where I could probably just go on there and search like, podcasts, searching right now, what podcast do you listen to? And I could see like 10 discussions or people have said, what podcast do you listen to? And like 32 replies, 8 replies, and just like read. And there's also like not that many podcasts that like get mentioned over and over on Twitter, or that, even if you go to Apple Podcasts and you go to any show, Apple Podcasts will at the bottom tell you, oh, if you like this show, you might like these other shows. And I'm pretty sure they're doing that algorithmically based on like what actual Apple Podcast listeners listen to. So there's a lot of ways where you can actually find out like what shows your listeners listen to. And ideally, if those shows are like, on YouTube where you can see the actual numbers, it's a really good signal as to like what, what's working. But also like general, like, Ethan asked me earlier what goes into making a quality podcast. And like, for me, it's like I said, there's like narrative structure, there's insights per minute. There's I think guest energy. I didn't really get into this, but like I've noticed that like my most downloaded episodes almost always are the ones where the guests are like super charismatic and like really interested in their subject matter. People just listen to those a lot longer. Like novelty, like this is like the trends. Like am I rehashing an old subject, or am I getting into something new that helps? And then like consistency, and then chemistry, where it's like not awkward, which I found is just like helpful to know the person and understand like how they're going to respond and react to you. So I think those things are kind of like consistent. And there hasn't been a lot of stuff I found in other shows where like, they're violating those rules and, having great, huge download numbers.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I put a link there in the chat for anybody who's interested. We're starting to create a version of the group where you can actually register continuously, and you'll always get the link to come and join us without registering for each individual session. We'll put all the recordings in a member area, which is already set up, and any downloads that are associated with any of the sessions that we do. So if you're interested, it's kind of an early adopter level right now. You can check that out, and you're welcome to sign up. And if you want more info, you can email me at ethan@growpodfaster.com. I don't know. We want to be respectful of Cortland's time. Man, insights per minute. I think you nailed it. That's really great. I always wish we could have a little bit more time for any questions from people that are attending. But if you do want to jump on next week, that Eventbrite link is in the chat, and we can have a more detailed discussion among ourselves next time. So feel free to do that, or go ahead and register to continue to join us. I don't know. Like I said, I want to be respectful of your time. Any parting words? We've mentioned Indie Hackers. I put a link there. People can go check out the site. Anything else you want to send people?
I got a good
Cortland?
another 10 minutes too, if anyone wants to talk. I'll just sit in here until the Zoom ends. But no, that's all I got. There's a podcasting group on Indie Hackers. So if you ever want to just like put a question out into the internet, go there and make a post. I'll probably see it, and a lot of other podcasters will too.
And I actually went in and I found a couple people in that group, and I invited them to attend here. So I know at least a couple of the people here are people from the podcasting group. So that was cool. I'm willing to, I think I can hang on for another 10 minutes as well. So I know sometimes Henry or Rob or Vinay or anybody else, feel free to jump off, but I'll commit to another 10 minutes as well. If anybody has comments or questions. Anybody else? Stephanie, have we talked to you before?
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Let me see if Stephanie has anything. You don't have to say
I do
anything,
actually
but...
have a question.
go
I
ahead.
made the end of the first session, and then I was moving the week after that. And so I was a little discombobulated. But Cortland, thank you very much for tonight. I do have a question for you. You mentioned that you love coding.
Yeah.
But you outsource your editing for the podcast. And I'm curious if there's any technical part of the podcast editing the podcast, or anything that you've kind of fallen into a rabbit hole or really like to do that you don't outsource?
I mean, if I could just not edit anything, I would. I'm not a huge fan of the editing. I used to edit like my first 3 episodes. I edited them all myself. You could probably tell if you listen to them. They're not that great. And then there's a kid who lived in like Minnesota. He was like kept emailing me like, "Hey, you should really pay someone to edit it, and that person should be me." And I'm like, no, I'm gonna learn how to do it. I want to do everything. And then eventually just sent me a recording of his version of one of my episodes compared to my version, and his was just so much better that I hired him. And he's been editing my podcast ever since. But I mean, like, to your question, like, what do I like doing? I mean, I guess there's a sense in which like I'm probably more self-conscious of my voice than anyone else, including editors. And so like I'll probably be extra careful to like clean up my speaking turns compared to anyone else. I'll just be like more paranoid about it. And so like that's one part that I kind of like always want to do myself, at least a little bit, listen to like what I said and make sure I don't sound like an idiot. And also like I really do care about like making sure the guest sounds good, because I think you really want your guest to be able to enthusiastically share like what you've done. And so like when I'm going through, like I leave a lot of notes specifically like, hey, this is a fine speaking term, but our guest like stuttered here and like mumbled here. And like, you might not think it's terrible, editor, but like sometimes guests get really freaked out when they hear themselves stuttering and they think that they sound awful. And so I'm pretty particular just about making sure everybody kind of sounds smarter and more eloquent than they actually are, if that makes sense.
I want to jump over. I know Rob had something, but I just want to see if Matthew in here. I know he's an indie hacker, so I was just curious if you had a question. It looked like maybe you had a little audio coming through, but if so, hop in. If not, I'm going to jump over to Rob. Rob, what were you going to say?
I was just going to ask you, Cortland, you said at the beginning that you weren't that excited about doing a podcast, and I'm curious, after you've been doing it for a while, what about doing the podcast got you excited? I was curious.
I think the long-term effects of meeting just so many people, because almost after every episode, it's like we just talk for 10 or 15 minutes. And like, I've got a business, they all run businesses, they all have various challenges and questions. And like, I've just made like some really good friends as a result of like running the podcast. It took like a year or two before I realized like that was happening. So that's exciting. I think just getting slowly better over time. Like you said, you have an interview show, just realizing that you're getting better, and it takes a lot of episodes and a lot of reps to realize, like, see the difference. And sometimes I'll just go back and listen to old episodes just to like reaffirm like, hey, yeah, I'm better than I used to be. So I think there's like a sense of pride there that I like. I used to be a little bit afraid going into each episode. Like I'd get nervous, and just seeing that disappear has been pretty cool. I think I was really worried about this, like compared to coding, where it's like, if you write something and it breaks, you just fix it and you don't release it until it's good. Whereas like a podcast episode, you kind of get like one shot, and if the episode doesn't go well, like that's your shot. And like, you can do some stuff in editing, but like you can't work miracles in editing. And every now and then I'll throw out an episode and tell the guest, hey, sorry, it didn't come out that great. Like, I don't think you're going to look your best here. Like, let's try it again. But in general, I just got nervous because I didn't like doing this thing where I only had one shot. And so seeing that kind of disappear and feeling like confident has made it just more, I think, fun to do a podcast. I think the research is also fun. A lot of things I just used to dread that turned out to be like, oh, this is actually kind of cool. Like just getting to learn about a different guest, like it's an excuse to learn. I think sometimes like everybody theoretically would love to learn, but when it's your job to have a bunch of guests on, they all come from different worlds and you have to research and learn about it, then like you end up learning a lot more and a lot faster than you would otherwise, because it's like a forcing function for that. So I like having that in my life as well. And knowing that as long as I have a podcast, I'm going to keep learning at a constant rate. And now that I'm doing this sort of trends and information thing, I'm going to also stay informed a lot better than I did in the past.
A follow-up to that, my own personal experience, it's interesting how you can shift your perspective on things and all of a sudden they become enjoyable. And actually a very relevant example, when we started our podcast, I was the one who would listen to the Indie Hackers podcast to see if there were guests that could go, that might be good examples for our shows. And at first it was like this thing where it's like, oh, okay, I got to do that. I got to go listen to this. And then I got to get to see if there's an email. And, it was just kind of I had made it into a chore. And the podcasting thing was like supposed to be for fun for Chris and I. And one day I was like, but wait, this is a great podcast. Like I just go for a 2-hour bike ride, listen to a few episodes. And then, when I get back, send some emails to some really cool people. And ever since I made that, shift in perspective, which was very small, it's exactly like you said. It's like, this is enjoyable. Like, this is cool. Like, this is what it's all about.
Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty crazy how that works, but I've experienced the exact same feelings a bunch of times.
Yeah, just to jump in on that, I've shared this before, Ethan and Cortland, that, one of my criteria now for a guest is, do I think I will enjoy a conversation with this person? Regardless of the topic, do I think in my research that I might enjoy a conversation with Cortland? Chris who's on is a good example. I think I may have reached out to him or he reached out to me, but part of my research is to see, do I think this is someone I want to have a conversation with? And then to your point, one of the biggest payoffs for me of being a podcaster has been the people that I have met. This mastermind is a perfect example of that.
Yeah, that's great. Great example. Anybody else in the attendees have some comments or questions? Did I hear Vinay?
Damien, I believe, has a question.
Oh, Damien. But I think, oh yeah, there he is.
Just raise his hand.
Okay, Damien, go for it, man. Say whatever you like. Yeah, you're a little bit jarbled, but try saying something.
All right, cool. Firstly, thank you very much. Cortland, I'd just like to ask, you mentioned there that a part of the work that you do, you go and you outsource, especially the editing, the post-processing.
Mm-hmm.
At what point when you're starting a podcast do you make the pivot to say, it's now financially viable for my time and also for the efficiency and also for the quality of the podcast to start outsourcing certain responsibilities?
Yeah. So for me, it was like pretty simple because, see, I released my podcast in like March 2017 and I'd started selling ads in like December of the previous year for like the newsletter and the website. So I was already like watching, like if you go to like the Indie Hackers page, product page and the Indie Hackers product directory, you can see kind of the timeline. And it's like my revenue was like kind of like doubling every month. So it was like, $800, $1,600, $3,200. So by the time I like launched my podcast, it was clear that like I was figuring out how to sell ads and that I was going to keep selling more and more ads. And it was clear also that like, this kid is going to do a much better job editing than me and save me time. And he was like crazy cheap. Like he was literally charging me like $30 an episode. And these were like hour-long episodes and he did a good job. So it was like a total no-brainer for me that like, I should 100% outsource this job to an expert who's going to save me time for like what was to me basically pennies. And then I could spend that time selling ads, et cetera. I think if you don't have like a revenue channel, you don't figure out like, you're not sure how you're making money, then it's harder to sort of like, assign a value to your time because your time basically has no value at that point in time. But you can always start. I mean, I know people who started podcasts and started selling ads before they even released an episode. And so I think having like, an income channel helps you make that decision.
All right, cool. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just a highlight that I'm drawing out from what you're saying too in the conversation so far. It's like having, not that it's easy, but having a very clear focus of your audience and like getting, connecting with them in such a way that they're enthusiastic about what you do. I mean, there's all sorts of ways I'm sure that you don't have luck, but you have luck in this way that your audience is particularly indie hackers who are trying to start projects that support things. And you happen to be one of the things that they're always seeing. So, hey, I want to start a podcast editing business. Why don't I ask Cortland if he needs that, So
Right.
It's an interesting advantage you have, but I feel like you could replicate that if you can cultivate enthusiastic audience.
Yeah. I gave a talk on luck a couple years ago. And like the biggest point was like, if you like routinely talk in public about what your goals are and what you're trying to achieve and like what you're stuck on, it gives other people a really good opportunity to help you. And often if you're doing things like putting out a podcast or helping anyone in any way, there's probably a lot of people out there who like you and want to help you, but don't see an avenue for that. And so you can like often like get lucky by just constantly talking about what you want. Like when I was selling podcast ads, I was writing in my newsletter and on my blog, like I'm trying to figure out how to sell ads. Here's what I tried this week. This worked, this didn't. And like, I got a ton of help. Some people were like, I'll buy an ad. My friend who ran a podcast is like, I've sold ads to these 5 people. Here are their email addresses. Like I got a lot of like help like that. That was lucky, but it was a direct result of like me saying like, here's where I'm stuck, which is why I love the whole transparency sort of phenomenon, because it's like, it's more acceptable today than it ever has been to basically say, hey, I'm not an expert. I don't know everything, and for everyone to just sort of like help each other, which is a good way to get lucky.
Crowdsource everything.
Outsource it all.
Right.
Cool. Well, I know you said you had about 10 minutes left, so that's about where we're at. And Cortland, again, you compounded your insights per minute. So I'll see you again soon. It's really been a pleasure. I think this has been one of our greatest sessions so far. So we really appreciate it. And for anybody, like I said, who'd like to join us next week, I'll put that Eventbrite link there at the end just so it's clear. And yeah, we can probably wrap it up pretty soon. I don't know if I have anything. Any final words from you, Cortland?
Nope, that's it. Thanks everybody for the great questions, and good luck with all your podcasts.
Thank you, Cortland.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Awesome. I'll anybody else can leave, but Henry, Vinay, or Rob, if you want to stay on to do a little chat, and I'll log us off Facebook, YouTube. But we'll say goodbye to everyone else, and thank you to Cortland.
Bye.
And we'll see you another day. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Later.